I want you to imagine like a modern multinational mega corporation.
Like a massive tech giant or maybe a global logistics firm, right?
Exactly. I mean, we all know how modern corporations exert power today. Lobbying, campaign donations, controlling data, that sort of thing.
Sure, the usual corporate
Well,
influence.
right. But I want you to imagine taking that power to an absolute dystopian extreme.
Yeah.
Like, imagine this corporation doesn't just influence the government, it effectively replaces it.
Wow. Okay. So, like, actually running the show.
Fully running the show. It maintains its own heavily armed private military. It
That is terrifying.
Right, and it subjugates tens of millions of people entirely for quarterly profits.
Yeah.
And then, and this is the craziest part, to cap it all off, imagine the founder of this corporation systematically burning every piece of evidence of how he built this empire.
Just destroying the paper trail completely.
Completely. He even threatened his own children to make sure his biography would never be published.
I mean, it sounds like the origin story of a cyberpunk villain or something.
It really does.
Because the idea that a single private company could hold sovereign power, wage wars, and literally draw the borders of a nation, it just seems totally divorced from the way we understand global politics today. We think of nation states creating corporations, not the other way around.
Exactly. But the thing is, this isn't some speculative sci-fi premise. It is the literal historical reality of how Africa's most populous state was brought into existence.
Yeah, it's wild when you actually dig into it.
It really is. So on today's deep dive, we are unpacking the historical reality detailed in this brilliant book by Max Sialon. It's called What Britain Did to Nigeria: A Short History of Conquest and Rule.
It's such a fantastic source.
Oh, it's incredible.
Yeah.
And our mission today is to essentially peel back the layers and entirely strip away the romanticized myths of the colonial era.
Which is so necessary, because if you look at the traditional historical accounts, they were largely written by the very British officials who executed this conquest in the first place.
Right. They investigated themselves and found they did nothing wrong.
Pretty much. They framed the whole thing as this noble, civilizing mission. Like, it was this grand imperial design to bring order to a chaotic, quote-unquote, dark continent.
And that framing has had incredibly persistent psychological effects, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you even see this phenomenon today among some modern demographics, this weird empire nostalgia.
Yeah, where people view the colonial period through these, like, rose-tinted glasses.
Exactly. They assume that whatever violence occurred was just, an unfortunate byproduct of a well-intentioned modernization project. But Silen's work forces us to confront the structural mechanics of what actually went down.
And what actually went down was definitely not a master-planned imperial design drawn up in some smoky room in London.
Not at all. It was a centuries-long sequence of mission creep, driven almost entirely by profit.
Which is exactly why we are tracing this causal chain from the very beginning. We're going to look at how early European economic interests evolved, starting from trading human beings to this wild geographic obsession, to corporate extortion, and finally to outright military subjugation.
It's a very long, very dark road.
It is. But before we get into the mechanics of British intervention, we really need to set a critical baseline for you, because if you were to travel back to, say, the year 1899 and ask someone living in Lagos or Kano or Benin what it meant to be a Nigerian,
They would look at you like you were speaking a different language.
Right, because before 1900, the concept of Nigeria literally did not exist.
It is a purely manufactured geopolitical entity. And to understand the gravity of Britain's actions, you really have to understand that this region was not a blank slate.
Not even close.
No, and it wasn't a single unified culture just waiting for a national identity to be handed to them. The landmass that the British would eventually, draw a box around and label Nigeria was this incredibly complex, vibrant, and diverse tapestry of distinct civilizations.
We are talking about ancient Islamic empires, highly sophisticated constitutional monarchies, and vast, completely decentralized democratic networks.
Yeah, and the British essentially marched into this thriving geopolitical ecosystem and forced it into a rigid, copy-and-paste administrative model designed entirely for resource extraction.
Okay, let's unpack that pre-colonial ecosystem. Because if we want to understand what the British destroyed or manipulated, we first have to understand the sheer scale and sophistication of what was already there.
We really need to completely dismantle that European myth of the Dark Continent.
Right, this absurd idea of an isolated primitive landmass.
Hmm.
So let's start in the north, looking at the Kanem-Borno Empire. The timeline alone here is just staggering. We were talking about an empire that arose around 8700.
8700, which makes it the longest ruling kingdom in African history. I mean, they maintained power for over 1,000 years.
Over a millennium.
Yeah. To put that in perspective for you, while Europe was fractured and staggering through the early Middle Ages, Kanem-Borno was operating as a massive, centralized superpower right around Lake Chad.
And they weren't isolated at all, right?
No, not at all. They had deeply established diplomatic and commercial links stretching all the way across the Sahara. We're talking trade routes to Libya, Morocco, Tunisia.
Wow.
They were exporting things like ivory, ostrich feathers, and captive labor, and they were importing horses, firearms, and salt.
And right next door to them, you have the house estates. And when we talk about the house estates, we aren't talking about like small nomadic settlements.
Far from it. We are talking about massive, heavily fortified city-states, places like Kano, Katsina, and Zaria.
Kano is just a phenomenal example of economic gravity. The book mentions that by the mid-19th century, Kano was the industrial and commercial heart of the region. And the records indicate he was handling roughly 30,000 camel loads of salt every single year.
30,000.
Yeah, and I want to pause on that metric for a second because it's really easy to just hear 30,000 camels and kind of gloss over it. But think about the logistical infrastructure required to support that.
It's massive.
Right. A single camel can carry roughly 300 to 400 pounds. So we're talking about moving thousands of tons of a highly valuable commodity across one of the most unforgiving deserts on Earth.
Which means you need way stations, you need complex financial credit systems, you need a massive merchant class.
And you need a military apparatus capable of protecting those supply lines from raids.
Exactly. That requires a level of bureaucratic organization that rivals literally any major European trading hub of the exact same era.
Absolutely. And they built their cities to reflect that wealth and obviously the need to protect it. Kano was surrounded by these massive defensive walls, right?
Oh, yeah. Some of those walls were 50 feet high and incredibly thick. They were designed specifically to withstand prolonged military sieges.
And they had farmland inside the walls too, didn't they?
They did. They engineered the city layout to include vast tracts of farmland inside the defensive perimeter, which meant they could essentially feed their population indefinitely if an enemy army surrounded them.
That is just brilliant urban planning. But the geopolitical landscape of the North isn't static. It undergoes a massive, violent transformation in the early 19th century.
Yeah, a huge shift.
And this brings us to Usman Dan Fodio and the Sokoto Caliphate. Dan Fodio was an Islamic cleric, and in 1804, he launches a jihad against the Hausa rulers. Now, the traditional narrative often frames this purely as a religious purification movement, right?
Yeah, that the Hausa kings were mixing Islam with animist traditions, and Dan Fodio just wanted a strict return to Orthodox Islam.
Right, but looking at the scale of what happened, I mean, this feels like it was driven by socioeconomic pressures just as much as theology.
Oh, absolutely. It was a brilliant synthesis of both. I mean, Dan Fodio certainly had intense religious motivations, there's no doubt about that, but he also tapped into deep-seated economic grievances.
Like taxation issues.
Exactly. The Hausa kings were heavily taxing the rural populations, particularly the Fulani pastoralists. There's rampant corruption, arbitrary confiscation of property. So Dan Fodio utilized religious fervor to mobilize a massive, disenfranchised underclass.
It's essentially a massive, aggressive corporate merger executed via cavalry and holy war.
That is a great way to put it.
Because Dan Fodio's forces don't just win a few skirmishes. They systematically dismantle the thousand-year-old political structures of the North. They completely absorbed the Hausa city-states and forged the Sokoto Caliphate.
Which becomes the largest pre-colonial state in all of Africa. I mean, it stretched from modern-day Mali all the way across to Cameroon.
And Dan Fodio didn't just conquer, did he? He actually instituted a highly organized administrative system.
He did. He appointed emirs to govern the various provinces under a unified Islamic legal code. He basically completely rewired the political DNA of the North.
Okay, so that's the North. But while the North was being consolidated under an Islamic caliphate, the political landscape south of the River Niger was operating on entirely different frequencies.
Yeah, equally sophisticated, but totally different paradigms.
If we look at the Yoruba people in the southwest, they form the Oyo Empire. And what is fascinating to me about Oyo is their system of governance.
It's incredible. It was a constitutional monarchy with a system of extreme checks and balances that would make, like, modern political theorists just marvel.
The mechanics of it are wild. The supreme ruler of the Oyo Empire was the Alafin, the king. But he wasn't an absolute dictator.
Right. His power was constantly held in check by this 7-member non-royal council called the Oyo.
And the Oyo possessed the ultimate political veto. If they determined that the elephant was acting tyrannically, or if he had simply lost the mandate to rule, they didn't just impeach him, they forced him to commit suicide.
Yeah. It's intense. They would formally present him with an empty calabash, or parrot's eggs, and pass a binding resolution that the earth had rejected him.
The earth had rejected him. Wow.
And culturally and legally, the elephant was required to take poison or hang himself. It was an absolute terminal vote of no confidence.
But wait, I have to ask, if the Oyo Council holds the ultimate kill switch, what stops them from just running a permanent rolling coup?
That's the logical next question.
Right, like if they can force the king to die whenever they disagree with his economic policy, aren't they the actual dictators? How does that system not just collapse into a corrupt oligarchy?
And that right there is the genius of their constitutional equilibrium. The system was designed to prevent the exact abuse of power you're describing, because if the Oyo forced an elephant to commit suicide, the leader of the Oyo, a position called the Bashorun, was legally and ritually obligated to die alongside the king.
Oh, wow. That is the ultimate definition of skin in the game.
Exactly. You cannot casually overthrow the government if it requires your own life as collateral.
I mean, that really ensures you only pull that lever in a true emergency.
Right. It ensured that this extreme measure was only used in the most dire existential crises of state. It created a profound political stability based on, essentially, mutual assured destruction.
That level of political engineering is just astounding.
Yeah.
And yet, it's just one model in the South. Because if we look at the Benin Empire, we see a totally different kind of achievement, specifically in urban engineering and art.
Oh, Benin is spectacular.
Seolan points out that the 1974 Guinness Book of Records actually described the walls of Benin City as perhaps the largest single archaeological phenomenon on the planet.
Yeah, they estimated it took something like 150 million hours of human labor to construct those earthworks.
150 million hours. The scale is hard to even conceptualize.
It really is. These earthworks were this massive network of moats and ramparts that extended for thousands of miles in total. They enclosed hundreds of towns and villages within the empire's sphere of influence.
And the capital, Benin City itself, was a marvel of urban planning. Long before many European capitals had functional sanitation or organized street layouts, Benin City was designed with perfect symmetrical street grids.
Yes, and they even had street lighting.
Wait, really? Street lighting back then?
Yeah, the streets were illuminated at night by massive lamps fueled by palm oil. The main thoroughfares near the Oba's palace were incredibly wide and kept immaculately clean.
That is just so far beyond the primitive stereotype.
Yeah.
And we haven't even touched on their metallurgy, the Benin bronze.
Yeah. Oh, the bronzes. The bronzes and terracotta sculptures of Benin are universally recognized today as absolute masterpieces of world art.
How were they making them?
They used a highly advanced metallurgical technique known as Cire Perdue, or lost wax casting.
Which is pretty complex, right?
Extremely. It requires an immense understanding of thermodynamics and material science. You have to sculpt a model in wax, encase it in clay, melt the wax out, and then pour in molten bronze to capture microscopic levels of detail.
And the tragic irony is how this sheer brilliance was received by the Europeans later on. When British forces eventually looted thousands of these bronzes in 1897 and brought them back to London, the British anthropological establishment literally suffered a collective cognitive dissonance.
They absolutely did. They were so deeply entrenched in their ideological formwork of African inferiority because, they needed that racism to justify their colonial subjugation.
Right. If these people are master artisans, you can't exactly claim you're there to civilize them.
Exactly. So they simply refused to believe that indigenous Africans were capable of such metallurgical sophistication.
It's nuts. They actually published theories suggesting that the bronzes must have been created by wandering Portuguese sailors.
Or perhaps some lost offshoot of ancient Egyptians.
Or even survivors of the mythical city of Atlantis. I mean, they would literally point to a fictional underwater city to avoid admitting that the people they were conquering were master artists.
It's a profound example of how historical erasure operates in real time.
It is. Okay, so we've talked about massive empires and centralized states. But to complete our picture of the pre-colonial landscape, we really have to look at the southeast, primarily the territory of the Igbo people.
Yes, because they operated on a completely different socio-political paradigm.
Right, they didn't build massive empires with kings and standing armies. They organized themselves into thousands of autonomous, decentralized communities.
Their defining cultural and political maxim was Igbo amagiedzes, which translates to the Igbo knows no king.
Which, I mean, from a Western perspective, immediately sounds like a recipe for total anarchy. If you don't have a centralized authority, like a monarch or an executive branch, how do you manage infrastructure? How do you settle disputes? How does this society actually function?
It functions as a highly robust peer-to-peer network. It was essentially a gerontocratic democracy.
Okay, meaning ruled by elders.
Exactly. Power didn't flow top-down from a monarch, it flowed horizontally. Authority was vested in the lineage elders and the village assemblies.
So what happens if two people have a dispute?
If a dispute arose, or a major decision needed to be made regarding trade or defense, a village council was convened. And crucially, these weren't exclusive aristocratic clubs. Any adult male in the community had the right to attend, speak, and debate the issues openly.
So it's almost like a direct democracy, heavily reliant on consensus, and merit too, right? Because titles and prestige in Igbo society weren't hereditary.
Right, you didn't become a leader just because your father was a leader. It was a fiercely meritocratic society. You achieved status by accumulating wealth through trade or farming, and then you effectively paid for titles, which granted you a seat among the respected elders.
Which allows for immense upward social mobility. It incentivizes hard work and entrepreneurship.
Which is exactly what made the Igbo incredibly dynamic and successful traders.
So if we look at the massive mosaic we've just laid out, you've got a 1,000-year-old trading empire in Kanem-Borno, the massive bureaucratic Sokoto Caliphate, the constitutional equilibrium of Oyo, the engineering marvels of Benin, and the decentralized democratic networks of the Igbo.
It's an incredibly vibrant picture.
It is. The societies were highly organized, heavily militarized in some cases, and deeply integrated into long-distance trade. Which brings us to the really pivotal question for this deep dive.
Right. If these indigenous structures were so robust and sophisticated, how on earth did a small island nation thousands of miles away manage to systematically dismantle and conquer them?
To understand that, we have to transition into the dark macroeconomic realities of the 15th through 19th centuries. Because the engine that fundamentally altered the trajectory of West Africa wasn't initially a desire for territory at all.
No, it was the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah. The dynamic shift begins in the late 1400s with the Portuguese. They were the first Europeans to heavily explore the West African coastline.
Initially, they were just looking for a sea route to Asia, but they established trading posts on islands like São Tomé, dealing in gold, pepper, and ivory.
But then the global economic paradigm shifts entirely. The European powers, quote-unquote, discover the Americas. They realize the immense agricultural potential of the New World, sugar, tobacco, cotton.
But the indigenous populations of the Americas are being decimated by European diseases and brutal forced labor.
Right. So the Europeans need a massive, robust labor force to make their new colonial economies viable, and West Africa becomes the target.
The scale of the human trafficking that followed is almost impossible to fully comprehend. The extraction of human capital from West Africa became a highly routinized industrial-scale operation.
Just give us a sense of those numbers because they are horrifying.
To give you just one terrifying metric from the sources, in a mere 54-year period, from 1676 to 1730, the region around the Bight of Benin alone shipped roughly 730,000 enslaved people across the Atlantic.
730,000 people in 50 years. From just one region.
Yes. It was so deeply entrenched that European maps literally reduced the entire region to its primary commodity. They labeled it simply the Slave Coast.
For 3.5 centuries, the primary export of this incredibly diverse landmass was its own people. And what is truly chilling is the bureaucratic accounting nature of this violence.
It was very clinical.
It wasn't just chaotic kidnapping. It was a heavily financialized market. The sources note that in the 17th century, the price of a male slave was fixed at 13 iron bars.
And those iron bars were a localized currency that European traders introduced specifically to facilitate this trade. It allowed them to standardize the commodification of human life.
I think the math the book uses makes it even sicker.
Yeah, one iron bar could buy half a gallon of brandy. So a human being was worth roughly 6.5 gallons of alcohol.
Wow. And I want to challenge the narrative of who was actually perpetrating this on the European side. Because the historical accounts often describe the British slave ship captains and crews as, quote, the very dregs of the community.
Right, portraying them as escaped convicts, violent criminals, people who couldn't function in polite society.
But isn't that a bit of a convenient deflection? I mean, weren't a lot of these voyages financed by the absolute upper crust of British
Oh,
society?
completely. High society, London bankers, respected politicians, wealthy aristocrats.
So calling the crews the dregs feels like a way to let the British elite off the hook for funding the entire enterprise.
That is a vital distinction to make. The men brutalizing the captives on the decks of the ships may have been marginalized members of European society, but the corporate architecture, the insurance, the shipbuilding, and the massive profits were entirely controlled by the most respectable members of the British establishment.
Right. The transatlantic slave trade literally fueled the capital accumulation that jump-started the Industrial Revolution.
It did. And to fully grasp the legal and moral depravity of that institutional backing, we really have to look at the Zong massacre of 1781.
Yeah, this is a moment where the mechanics of maritime law and human trafficking collide in just the most horrific way imaginable.
The Zong was a British slave ship operating out of Liverpool. It was severely overcrowded, carrying over 400 enslaved Africans, and due to navigational errors by the captain, the voyage took much longer than expected.
So they start running out of supplies.
Exactly. The crew realized they did not have enough water to sustain both themselves and the captives.
Now, under the perverse economic logic of the slave trade, if the enslaved people died of thirst or disease, that was considered a natural loss.
Right. And the financial hit would fall entirely on the ship's owners. They couldn't claim insurance for people who simply died in transit.
But, and this is where it becomes pure, calculated, evil maritime law had a concept called general average.
Yes.
Can you explain general average in this context?
So, if a captain had to jettison cargo into the sea to save the ship and the remaining crew from a crisis, the owners could legally claim the value of that lost cargo from their insurers.
So viewing human beings entirely as cargo, the crew of the Zong executed a mathematically calculated mass murder.
It's sickening. Over the course of several days, they dragged 132 living, breathing men, women, and children onto the deck and threw them overboard to drown in the Atlantic Ocean.
And they did this specifically so the ship's owners in Liverpool could file an insurance claim for £30 per murdered person.
£30 per person? And when the ship got back to England, the owners did exactly that. They sued the insurance company for the money.
And didn't the initial court ruling actually side with the ship owners?
They did. The judge essentially ruled that throwing 132 humans into the sea was legally no different than throwing 132 horses or bales of cotton overboard.
That is just,
Yeah.
I can't even fathom that level of callousness.
It took immense public outcry and the efforts of abolitionists to even get the case heard on appeal. And even then, the captain and crew were never prosecuted for murder. They were only tried for insurance fraud.
Insurance fraud. Unbelievable. It is the ultimate crystallization of an economic system that entirely divorced itself from morality. But history is deeply paradoxical, because the horror of cases like the Zong actually fueled the British abolitionist movement.
Right. And in 1807, Britain officially passes the Slave Trade Act, making it illegal for British subjects to participate in the transatlantic slave trade.
This is where the causal chain takes a massive, totally counterintuitive pivot. Because, you would logically think that Britain abolishing the slave trade would mean they pack up their ships, leave West Africa alone, and the region begins to heal.
That would be the logical assumption.
But the exact opposite happens. Abolition becomes the catalyst for colonization.
It's one of the great ironies of imperial history. Abolishing the slave trade gave the British government something they didn't have before: a universally acceptable moral justification to aggressively intervene in West African affairs.
So they weren't there to conquer, they told themselves. They were there on a humanitarian policing mission.
Exactly. Because to enforce the ban, you can't just pass a law in London. You have to physically stop the ships. So Britain deploys a naval blockade, the West Africa Squadron, to patrol the coastline and intercept slave ships from other nations like Spain and Portugal, who were still actively trading.
And when the British Navy intercepted these ships, they didn't sail them back to the specific villages the people had been kidnapped from, did they?
No, that would have been logistically impossible. Instead, they took tens of thousands of these liberated captives to a new British colony they established called Sierra Leone, specifically the capital, Freetown.
This creates a fascinating geopolitical dynamic. Because now, in Sierra Leone, you have this massive rapidly growing population of freed Africans.
Mhm.
And the British begin subjecting them to an intensive process of cultural assimilation.
Very intensive. They are given Western names, they are taught English, they are educated in British missionary schools, and they are converted to Christianity.
Britain was essentially incubating a new demographic of highly educated, English-speaking Anglophile Africans.
Yes, and over the next few decades, many of these Sierra Leoneans, who are known as Saro, began migrating back down the coast to places like Lagos and the Niger Delta.
And what was their role once they went back?
They became the clerks, the missionaries, and the cultural intermediaries who actually facilitated British commercial and political expansion into the interior. They were basically the vanguard of soft power.
So you have the moral justification of abolition, providing the military footholds on the coast, and you have this new class of cultural intermediaries. But there is a massive underlying economic engine driving all of this.
The Industrial Revolution.
Right.
Mhm.
Britain's economy is transitioning from an agrarian society to a mechanized, factory-based powerhouse.
Mm.
They might not be treating in human labor anymore, but their appetite for raw materials and new markets to sell their manufactured goods is more voracious than ever.
Which forces a radical shift in British strategy. For centuries, European traders had stayed on the coastline, dealing with African middlemen who brought goods and slaves from the interior.
Because the interior was essentially a mystery to them, right?
A total mystery. It was literally a blank space on their maps. But to feed the industrial machine, they needed direct access to the source of raw materials. They had to push inland. And this sparked an absolute obsession with finding the course and the termination of the River Niger.
It's really hard to overstate how mythic the River Niger was to European geographers at the time. It was basically the geographic equivalent of the space race.
There were all sorts of wild speculations. That it flowed east and connected to the Nile, or that it flowed west into the Senegal River, or that it emptied into a massive inland sea.
Weren't there even legends about cities made of gold?
Oh yeah, legends of cities with roofs made of solid gold along its banks. So the British government and various geographical societies start funding these massive, highly publicized expeditions to solve the riddle.
And the most famous of the early explorers was a Scottish doctor named Mungo Park. In 1795, he embarks on an incredibly grueling overland journey from the Gambia.
It was a brutal trip. He suffers disease, he is imprisoned, he is robbed, but he finally reaches the banks of the Niger at Ségou in modern-day Mali.
Mungo Park's journal entry upon seeing the river is practically a religious text for the era. He writes about seeing the long-sought-for majestic Niger glittering in the morning sun as broad as the Thames at Westminster and flowing slowly to the eastward. He says he hastened to the water's edge and drank from it, lifting up a fervent prayer.
From a European perspective, it was a monumental triumph. But, as C. Ellen points out in the book, there is a profound arrogance in the framing of this event. Generations of colonial textbooks and even Nigerian school children later on were taught that Mungo Park discovered the River Niger.
Which is objectively absurd. It's like me walking into your living room and claiming I discovered your sofa.
That's a perfect way to put it.
Millions of indigenous Africans had been living along the Niger, fishing in it, building empires on its banks, and navigating its currents for thousands of years. Park didn't discover it. He just survived long enough to confirm its existence to the Royal Geographical Society in London.
And survival was definitely the operative word, because for Europeans, West Africa was an epidemiological nightmare. The region actually earned the terrifying moniker, the white man's grave.
Because of malaria.
Right. Before the mid-19th century, Europeans had no understanding of how malaria was transmitted, nor did they have effective prophylaxis.
The mortality rates for these expeditions were just apocalyptic. We aren't talking about a 10% or 20% casualty rate. Mungo Park's second expedition in 1805 is a perfect example. He left the coast with 44 European soldiers and carpenters.
And by the time they reached the Niger River, 39 of them were already dead from fever and dysentery.
39 out of 44. And Park himself eventually died on the river, likely drowning while under attack. The British government poured £500,000 into these expeditions, and the primary return on investment was a very long list of dead British officers.
But the explorers who did manage to survive the climate and push deep into the northern interior had encounters that completely shattered the prevailing British assumptions about African societies.
Yeah, the British public had been fed this steady diet of propaganda, portraying Africans as naked, illiterate savages living in chaos. But then you look at the 1820s expedition of Hugh Clapperton and Dixon Denham into the Oyo Empire and the Sokoto Caliphate.
This is one of the most fascinating intersections in the entire book. Denham and Clapperton manage to cross the Sahara Desert, which is a miracle in itself. They arrive in Borno completely destitute, their supplies are gone, they are exhausted, and essentially they are at the absolute mercy of the local ruler, Mohammed El-Kanemi.
And if El-Kanemi was the savage the British press claimed, he would have just killed them and taken what little they had left.
Instead, El-Kanemi's administration processes them with a level of bureaucratic precision that rivaled anything in London. When some of the explorers' belongings were seized by locals, El-Kanemi didn't just shrug it off.
No. His officials produced an extraordinarily detailed, itemized inventory of every single missing item, no matter how trivial.
It's amazing. The document is signed by 7 different imams and elders, and it lists things like 2 pieces of unused soap, 1 toothbrush, 2 towels, and 3 pairs of spectacles.
That is a stunning display of administrative law and order. And El-Kanemi himself was a deeply pragmatic leader. But Denham, who was a British Army officer, actually convinced some local raiders to let him tag along on a slave-capturing expedition completely against El-Kanemi's explicit advice.
Yes, Denham basically wanted the thrill of battle. It was an incredibly foolish move. The raiding party was ambushed and completely routed.
Denham got what he asked for.
He really did. His horse was shot out from under him, he was stripped completely naked by the enemy, and he barely escaped into the desert with his life covered in wounds. He only survived because El-Kanemi's men managed to find him and bring him back.
It severely undermined the idea of British martial superiority. But the defining moment of this expedition is when Hugh Clapperton travels further west into the Sokoto Caliphate and meets Sultan Bello.
This meeting is just brilliant.
Clapperton arrives expecting to find a primitive warlord. Instead, he is ushered into a room and finds Sultan Bello sitting elegantly on a carpet, wearing a regal blue robe and a white turban, deeply engrossed in reading a book.
Sultan Bello was a brilliant scholar. He was a prolific author of Islamic jurisprudence, history, and poetry. And when he began conversing with Clapperton, the intellectual dynamic was completely inverted from what the British expected.
Right, Bello wasn't in awe of Clapperton. He was deeply curious, and he began interrogating the British explorer about global geopolitics and theology.
Bello starts asking incredibly specific questions. He asks for news about the Greek War of Independence, he asks for geographic details about the English coast, and then he pivots to religion.
He starts grilling Clapperton on the sectarian differences within Christianity.
Yes, he's asking about the theological distinctions between Nestorians, Thessalians, and Catholics.
And Clapperton is completely out of his depth. I mean, he is a naval officer, not a theologian. It's such a brilliant role reversal. It's almost like an alien arriving on Earth and expecting to find monkeys, but being interviewed by a Harvard scholar who immediately starts cross-examining the alien on quantum physics.
That's a hilarious comparison, but it's totally accurate. Clapperton literally has to admit in his journals that he couldn't answer Bello's questions. He wrote that he wasn't versed enough in religious subtleties to resolve these knotty points.
It forces Clapperton to write back to London and explicitly state that the people of the interior are civilized, learned, humane, and pious. It proved that complex intellectual civilization existed in the heart of Africa.
But despite this mutual respect, the overarching geopolitical goal of the British hadn't changed. They still needed to figure out the Niger River to open up trade.
And the massive breakthrough finally comes in 1830. A young explorer named Richard Lander, who was actually the former servant of Hugh Clapperton, manages to follow the Niger downstream.
And he discovers that it doesn't flow into a desert or an inland sea. It splinters into a massive delta and flows directly into the Atlantic Ocean right at the Bight of Biafra.
That discovery is the absolute inflection point in Nigerian history. It proved that the River Niger was a massive, navigable superhighway leading straight from the Atlantic Ocean into the incredibly fertile, resource-rich heart of West Africa.
And right around the same time, the British figure out that taking daily doses of quinine, which is derived from the bark of the cinchona tree in South America, acts as a highly effective prophylactic against malaria.
So the white man's grave is suddenly survivable. The door is unlocked, the pathway is clear, and the British motives shift violently from geographic curiosity to aggressive, unrestrained economic extraction.
And the commodity they are desperate to extract is palm oil. As the Industrial Revolution accelerated in Europe, the demand for lubricants for the massive new factory machines absolutely skyrocketed.
Plus, as populations urbanized, the demand for cheap soap increased dramatically too, right?
Exactly. And palm oil, which grew abundantly in the wild across southern Nigeria, was the perfect ingredient for both.
The shift in the economy is staggering. The region transitions from exporting human beings to exporting agricultural commodities so rapidly that the British actually renamed the area. It goes from being the Slave Coast to the oil rivers.
By the 1850s, the port of Liverpool alone was importing enough palm oil from this region to manufacture 30,000 tons of soap every single year. The wealth being generated was astronomical.
But the men doing the actual trading on the ground, the British merchants arriving on these ships, were not cultured gentlemen representing the crown. Seolan sources describe them as ruffians of the worst kind.
They were brutal. In many cases, these were the exact same merchant houses and sometimes the exact same individuals who had been running the illegal slave trade just a generation prior.
They simply swapped the cargo from humans to palm oil, but they kept the violent, lawless culture of the slave ships.
There are accounts of these British supercargoes tying African boys to the rigging of their ships for 12 hours straight in the blazing sun for minor acts of insubordination.
Awful.
Right.
However, despite their brutality, these British merchants didn't have the military capacity to just march inland and harvest the palm oil themselves. They were entirely dependent on the African middlemen, the coastal chiefs and kings who controlled the rivers and the inland supply routes.
And to access those markets, the British had to navigate a deeply entrenched indigenous economic system known as the kami, or the dash.
Let's break down the mechanics of the dash because it's critical to understanding both the 19th century trade and modern Nigerian politics. The dash was essentially a mandatory tribute or payment. When a British ship arrived, before they were allowed to trade, they had to give significant gifts, cloth, firearms, alcohol, iron to the local king or chief.
And this wasn't a one-off bribe, it was a highly systematized form of exchange. The local leaders viewed it as a legitimate tariff, a right of access to their sovereign markets.
So in a decentralized, stateless market system, without a formalized customs agency or border patrol, the dash acted as a localized port tax.
Exactly. It was the cost of doing business, ensuring protection, and favorable trading terms.
But the long-term consequences of this are fascinating to me. Because fast forward a century, when the British fully colonized the region and impose a rigid Western legal framework post-colonial English common law, they take this deeply embedded, culturally legitimate system of tribute and legally redefine it as bribery and corruption.
Yeah, it completely flips the script.
Right. So if we look at the bigger picture here, a significant portion of Nigeria's modern-day struggle with systemic corruption is arguably a direct, mutated descendant of this 19th century dash system. The Europeans entrenched rent-seeking behaviors to secure trade and then later criminalized the very system they helped institutionalize.
It's a perfect example of how colonial legal frameworks shatter traditional economic structures. But in the mid-19th century, the British merchants had to pay the dash. They were bleeding profit to these African middlemen. And no middleman was more powerful, more brilliant, or more infuriating to the British than King Jaja of Opobo.
Jaja of Opobo is one of the most compelling historical figures I have ever read about. His life trajectory is almost unbelievable. He was born around 1821 in an Igbo village. As a young boy, he is kidnapped and sold into slavery in the Niger Delta. He starts at the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic ladder.
But Jaja possessed a transcendent intellect and an unparalleled head for business. In the trading houses of the Delta, enslaved people could actually work their way up through merit.
And Jaja was so successful at trading palm oil that he eventually bought his own freedom. He rose through the ranks so quickly that he became the head of the Annapepel trading house in the city of Bonny.
He is essentially a 19th century John D. Rockefeller or Cornelius Vanderbilt. He understands corporate structuring, he understands leverage, and he understands vertical integration.
Eventually, a civil war breaks out in Bonny in 1869, and Jaja realizes he doesn't need to fight a protracted war. He executes a brilliant corporate secession.
He takes his followers, moves strategically to a new location on a crucial river junction, and founds an entirely new kingdom called Opobo.
And Opobo was perfectly positioned to completely choke off the palm oil supply from the interior to the coast. Jaja created a total monopoly. He was employing thousands of people. He had his own private navy of 50 massive war canoes armed with breech-loading rifles and cannons.
And he was exporting thousands of tons of palm oil directly to merchant houses in Liverpool, entirely cutting out the British middlemen on the coast.
The British consuls were terrified of him, but they also respected him. Richard Burton, the famous explorer, met Jaja and described him as young, healthy, powerful, and possessing an intense, ambitious energy.
And Jaja wasn't some isolated warlord. He was incredibly cosmopolitan. He hired a freed African-American woman from Kentucky to serve as his personal secretary. He sent his 13-year-old son to be educated at a boarding school in Cheshire, England.
He understood the global game better than the Europeans trying to play him.
Which is exactly why the British found him so dangerous. In the 1880s, the European powers are gearing up for the scramble for Africa. The British government starts sending consuls up and down the coast, trying to get local chiefs to sign treaties of protection.
These treaties were essentially legal traps designed to surrender African sovereignty to Britain in exchange for vague promises of security.
Right. And in 1884, the British consul, Edward Hyde Hewitt, comes to Opo and presents one of these standard treaties to Jaja. Now, most chiefs couldn't read English and just sign whatever was put in front of them.
But Jaja reads the fine print. He acts as his own high-powered corporate attorney. He looks at the treaty and specifically points to the word protection.
Jaja demanded that Hewitt define, in writing, the exact legal parameters of protection. He wanted absolute assurance that signing this document did not mean Britain would annex his country, interfere with his government, or break his monopoly on the interior markets.
Jaja actually forced the British consul to draft a customized amendment to the treaty, explicitly stating that Opobo's sovereignty and trading rights were untouched. It is a masterful piece of legal negotiation. Jaja signs the amended treaty, thinking he has secured his kingdom's future.
But he underestimated the sheer bad faith of the British imperial machine. By 1887, a new British acting consul arrives. His name is Harry Johnston.
And Johnston is bad news.
Oh, he's the worst. Johnston is young, fiercely ambitious, deeply racist, and entirely committed to expanding the British Empire at any cost. He realizes he cannot beat Jaja intellectually, and he cannot beat him commercially, so he resorts to outright treachery.
Johnston decides to lure Jaja into a trap. He invites Jaja to a meeting on a British gunboat, claiming he wants to resolve their ongoing trade disputes peacefully. Now, Jaja is naturally suspicious. He knows the British have warships, so he refuses to go unless he receives an absolute, ironclad guarantee of his safety.
And Johnston provides it. He writes a formal letter to Jaja on behalf of Her Majesty's government, explicitly promising safe conduct. Johnston literally wrote, "I hereby assure you that whether you accept or reject my proposal tomorrow, no restraint whatever will be put upon you. You will be free to go as soon as you have heard the message."
It is an unambiguous pledge. So Jaja, believing that a formal written promise from a British official representing Queen Victoria actually meant something, boards the British gunboat.
Yeah.
And the moment he steps into the meeting room, Johnston springs the trap. He drops all pretense of negotiation and issues an ultimatum.
Johnston tells Jaja, "You will surrender immediately and be transported to Accra for trial. If you refuse, you will be declared an outlaw, a massive bounty will be placed on your head, and the British Navy will mercilessly bombard Opobo into dust." He gave Jaja 1 hour to decide.
It is state-sponsored kidnapping. Even the British Prime Minister at the time, Lord Salisbury, upon hearing about the incident, admitted in private correspondence that Johnston's actions were tantamount to kidnapping.
But they went ahead with it anyway.
Right. They transport King Jaja to Accra in the Gold Coast, and they put him on trial. And this trial is one of the most grotesque mockeries of justice in colonial history.
The trial was presided over by a British naval officer, Admiral Hunt Grubb. They charged Jaja with blocking trade and breaching the treaty he had signed, but the legal mechanics of the trial are what truly expose the hypocrisy. Admiral Hunt Grubb effectively suspended the foundational doctrine of British common law, the presumption of innocence.
Right. Instead of the prosecution having to prove Jaja was guilty, Hunt Grubb looked at Jaja and demanded that the king provide evidence to prove he was innocent. He completely reversed the burden of proof. It was a kangaroo court designed with a predetermined outcome.
Predictably, Jaja was found guilty. He was stripped of his kingship, his wealth was seized, and he was exiled across the Atlantic to the West Indies, specifically to St. Vincent. He lived out his final years in exile, suffering from deep depression and declining health.
It's just so incredibly tragic.
The British eventually relented and allowed him to return to Africa as a private citizen, but he died on the voyage home in 1891.
I mean, imagine you are another African king or a wealthy merchant sitting in the Niger Delta, and you watch this unfold. You watch a man who was arguably the wealthiest, most heavily armed, most legally savvy indigenous leader in the region, a man who secured a written guarantee of safety. And you watch the British Empire casually lie, kidnap him, hold a sham trial, and deport him across the ocean. What is the psychological impact of that?
The chilling effect was absolute. The message broadcast to every leader in West Africa was undeniable. No amount of wealth, no military strength, and no legal acumen will protect you. You either submit completely to British commercial dictates or you will be eradicated. The destruction of Jaja removed the final significant obstacle to a total European monopoly.
And here's where the story shifts from tragic to downright dystopian. Because the entity that steps into the power vacuum left by Jaja wasn't initially the British government. The British government didn't want to spend taxpayer money administering a massive jungle territory.
No, they wanted the resources, not the bills.
Right. So they outsourced the conquest of Nigeria to a private, profit-seeking corporation. And at the head of that corporation was a man who was arguably the most secretive, ruthless, and successful imperialist you've never heard of. George Dashwood Tobin Goldie.
George Goldie is the phantom architect of modern Nigeria. Historically, men who conquer nations and draw new borders build massive monuments to themselves. They commission biographies. They want their names etched in stone. Goldie had the exact opposite psychological profile. He had a pathological obsession with erasing his own footprint from history.
He literally destroyed the evidence of his own life. He systematically burned his diaries, his letters, and all his personal papers. When he was dying, he gathered his children and made them swear a solemn oath that they would never write a biography of him or help anyone else write one, threatening to curse them from beyond the grave if they did. What kind of mind is that?
It is the mind of a man who knows that the methods he used to acquire power would not withstand the scrutiny of history or morality. Goldie's background gives us some clues. He was an aristocrat, born in the Isle of Man, but he was a rebel. He attended the Royal Military Academy in Woolwich, trained as an engineer, but freely admitted he was blind drunk when he sat for his final exams.
Wow.
He dropped out of the military, received a massive inheritance, and spent 3 years wandering the globe.
He actually lived in a Bedouin camp in the Egyptian desert, learning Arabic, immersing himself in Islamic culture, and allegedly carrying on an illicit affair with a local woman. He was a man with a legendary explosive temper, a voracious appetite for women, and an absolutely ruthless pragmatic streak.
He eventually gets involved in his family's struggling palm oil trading business in the Niger Delta, and Goldie immediately recognizes the core inefficiency of the market competition. The various British trading firms were constantly undercutting each other to buy oil from the Africans, driving the purchase prices up.
So what does he do?
Goldie's solution was brutal, but effective. He ruthlessly engineered a series of aggressive mergers and buyouts until he had amalgamated all the British firms into one massive conglomerate.
He effectively created a cartel. And then he executes his masterstroke. In 1886, Goldie goes to the British government and secures a royal charter for his company, which he renames the Royal Niger Company, or the RNC.
We have to pause and critically examine the legal and political mechanics of a royal charter because it is the foundational sin of the Nigerian state. A royal charter meant the British government legally delegated its sovereign powers to Goldie's private corporation.
Wait, they just outsourced their government?
Basically, yes. The RNC was granted the legal right to administer justice, levy taxes, sign treaties with foreign powers, and most importantly, maintain its own heavily armed private military force, the Royal Niger Constabulary.
It is the privatization of imperialism. The British government effectively said, we want the economic benefits of controlling West Africa, but we don't want to pay for the civil service or the soldiers. So Goldie, you take the financial risk. You govern the territory. You extract the resources. You pay your shareholders. And in exchange, Britain gets to claim the land on the global map.
It is a stunning abdication of moral responsibility. You are handing the lives, lands, and futures of millions of indigenous people to a corporate board of directors whose only legal fiduciary duty is to maximize quarterly profits.
And when human lives are subordinate to shareholder dividends, the results are predictably horrific. The RNC ran its territories with a level of brutality that Ceylon rightly compares to corporate terrorism. Because they had to maintain a private army on a shoestring budget to keep profits high, they cut every possible corner regarding human welfare.
The most glaring example of this systemic cruelty is the Mutiny of 1887. The RNC wanted to expand into harvesting rubber. So an RNC agent hires 160 laborers from Sierra Leone, these are British subjects, not slaves, to work on a rubber expedition deep in the interior.
And the conditions these laborers were subjected to were essentially a death sentence. The company executives refused to provision them properly to save money. These men were doing agonizing manual labor in a malarial jungle, and their official daily food ration was literally 2 bananas a day.
2 bananas. That's it. Obviously, the men begin starving to death. They suffer from severe thirst, dysentery, and exhaustion. Desperate, they attempt to protest. They complain to the management and refuse to work until they are fed. It is a basic labor strike.
But how does a corporation with its own army handle a labor dispute? They classify it as a violent mutiny.
Right. The RNC's agent general, William Wallace, arrives at the camp with heavily armed troops from the constabulary. He orders the starving, unarmed laborers to be locked inside a compound. The tension escalates, and one of the British RNC employees draws his revolver and shoots one of the Sierra Leonean laborers point-blank in the head.
And that single shot triggers a massacre. The constabulary troops open fire on the trapped laborers. Between 6 and 14 men are slaughtered, and many more are severely wounded. And the corporate cover-up that follows is textbook.
The RNC executives didn't fire the men responsible, they kept them on the payroll.
Of course they did.
They internally classified the incident as a case of hot-blooded butchery, acknowledging it was murder, but argued that punishing the white officers would show weakness to the native population. Goldie used his immense political leverage in London to ensure a half-hearted government inquiry was quietly buried.
The violence wasn't just physical. It was embedded in the corporate judiciary. The RNC was legally allowed to appoint its own judges. They appointed a man named Sir James Marshall as their Chief Justice. Marshall was a man completely unencumbered by the rule of law. He once proudly declared his judicial philosophy, stating he was the type of judge who would simply order a man to be hanged on Monday morning.
He ran a judicial dictatorship. In one terrifying instance, several RNC employees were investigated for an alleged mutiny. The company's own internal directors investigated the men and completely exonerated them of all charges. But Chief Justice Marshall didn't care. He ignored the exoneration and ordered the men to be thrown into a squalid prison anyway, just to make a point about his own authority.
This was the quote-unquote civilization the British were bringing.
But physical force and kangaroo courts weren't Goldie's most effective tools for conquest. His ultimate weapon was paper, specifically contract law weaponized through fraud. The RNC embarked on a massive campaign to secure legal title to the land via treaties.
And they outsourced this treaty-signing campaign to a man who would eventually become the most famous or infamous colonial administrator in African history, Frederick Lugard. Before he became the Governor-General of Nigeria, Lugard was essentially a corporate mercenary working for the RNC.
Lugard's mandate was to race into the interior, particularly the Borgu region, and get as many local kings and chiefs as possible to sign RNC treaties before the rival French or German empires could reach them. These documents were entirely one-sided. By signing, the African leaders were legally surrendering their sovereignty, granting the RNC absolute monopoly rights over all trade, mining, and agriculture in their territory, and placing themselves under British protection.
But the fraud lies in the linguistics and the intent. These were highly complex legal documents drafted in formal Victorian English property law. Almost none of the African kings could read English, and their indigenous legal systems often didn't even possess the concept of permanently alienating communal land to a private corporation.
Exactly. When Lugard presented these treaties, the translations provided by interpreters were deliberately vague or entirely fabricated. Lugard would tell the kings they were simply signing a pact of peace, a letter of friendship, or an agreement for free trade. He deliberately omitted the clauses about surrendering their sovereignty and land.
The historical record refers to these as the X treaties, because the illiterate kings would simply draw an X, or a crude mark at the bottom of the page, completely oblivious of the fact that under European international law, that ink mark meant they had just given away their ancestral homeland to a company listed on the London Stock Exchange. And the fraud wasn't just in the translation. Lugard literally forged the documents.
The evidence of fabrication is overwhelming. In some treaty batches Lugard submitted, the signatures or marks of vastly different, geographically separated kings were all clearly drawn by the exact same hand like Lugard's or his clerks.
My favorite, and by favorite I mean the most audaciously corrupt example, is a treaty Lugard presented to the RNC board. The treaty was supposedly signed by a specific king. But when someone actually looked at the Arabic script of the signature, it didn't spell the king's name. It spelled the word Absalamu.
When Lugard was confronted with the fact that the signature didn't match the king he claimed had signed it, he didn't even flinch. He instantly fabricated a story, claiming that Absalamu was actually the king's deeply held, secret, private name that he only used for special occasions. It was a blatant, verifiable forgery.
But here is the most crucial geopolitical question. Why did the British government, the most powerful empire on earth, accept these obviously fraudulent forged treaties scrawled by a corporate mercenary?
Because the British government desperately needed them for the Berlin Conference. In 1884 and 1885, the major European powers gathered in Berlin to systematically carve up the African continent and assign territories to each other to avoid a European war. The central legal doctrine they established at Berlin was the principle of effective occupation.
Meaning you couldn't just point at a map and say that's ours. You had to prove you had a physical presence, administrative control, and legal treaties with the local rulers in that specific territory.
Precisely. The British government didn't have the resources or the treaties to prove effective occupation of the Niger region. But George Goldie did. Goldie walked into the Berlin Conference with a massive stack of hundreds of these fraudulent ex-treaties gathered by Lugard and his agents.
And the British diplomats laid those corporate contracts on the table in front of the French and the Germans and used them to successfully claim legal sovereignty over the entire lower Niger basin. A private corporation, utilizing forged documents, mistranslated contracts, and a private army, quite literally drew the international borders of what would eventually become the modern nation of Nigeria.
When the British government finally decided to revoke the Royal Niger Company's charter in 1900 and take direct colonial control, they didn't punish Goldie for his corporate terrorism, they paid him off. They bought the territory from the RNC for a massive sum, transferring the corporate borders directly into imperial borders. The corporate asset became a colonial state.
So, synthesizing this entire harrowing journey, what is the ultimate reality we are left with? We started this deep dive exploring the vibrant complexity of the pre-colonial world. We looked at the thousand-year stability of Kanem Borno, the constitutional brilliance of the Oyo Empire, the urban mastery of Benin, and the democratic dynamism of the Igbo.
We saw how that intricate ecosystem was first destabilized and economically rewired by 3 centuries of transatlantic human trafficking. We saw how the abolition of that trade provided the moral cover for military intervention and cultural assimilation.
We followed the deadly, obsessive geographic race to map the Niger River, watching as explorers realized they weren't dealing with savages, but with scholars like Sultan Bello, who possessed a global intellectual curiosity. We saw the transition to the palm oil economy, the entrenchment of the dash system, and the tragic, treacherous destruction of brilliant indigenous capitalists like King Jaja.
And finally, we saw the culmination of this process in the unchecked corporate tyranny of George Goldie and the Royal Niger Company, who used starvation, sham courts, and forged treaties to build a monopoly that eventually morphed into a nation-state.
The so what of this history is profound. If you look at the complex political, ethnic, and economic challenges facing modern Nigeria today, you cannot understand them in a vacuum. You cannot forcibly weld together dozens of vastly different ancient civilizations, trap them inside borders drawn by a profit-driven corporation, subject them to decades of extractive corporate terrorism and colonial divide-and-rule tactics, and then expect a frictionless transition into a stable, unified, Western-style democracy.
The instability isn't an anomaly. It is the direct structural legacy of how the state was engineered. The deep-seated issues of corruption, the ethnic tensions, the struggle for a cohesive national identity, these are the inheritance of a system that was designed from its inception not to govern a people, but to extract resources for foreign shareholders.
Which leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to consider. When a modern nation's literal geographic borders, its foundational legal frameworks, and its initial governance structures were conceived and executed entirely by a secretive, unaccountable, multinational corporation. Is it even possible for that nation to ever fully decolonize its own political DNA? Or is the ghost of George Goldie, operating from behind the ashes of his burned diaries, still quietly writing the rules of the game today?
It is a question that challenges the very foundation of post-colonial sovereignty.
Think about that mega corporation we imagined at the start. You might not see their logo on the flag anymore, but if you look closely enough at the foundation, you can still see their fingerprints everywhere. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.